everyone, it's Ben Hansen and Brittany Barbieri, and we're here today to give you an update on this case that we've called the Firefly UAPs. Now, this was a series of events that took place mostly in eastern Wisconsin, but also into Michigan and other parts around the world. Similar things happening, but today we're going to focus on the case that primarily took place on December 1st and into the 2nd. And a lot of people have been asking, well, what took us so long to do this? It's been over a month since we began investigating this. We ask people to first go back and watch the first video in this playlist. So if you go back on YouTube, and it should be connected here. If you don't, this is not going to make any sense at all. I mean, we are going to slightly recap what's in the videos, but I can guarantee you this is going to be a long video, isn't it, Britt?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, and it's not what we want, but what we found is that you really have to do a long form type of explanation on this, because a lot of people have had questions as to what we were doing, when it was done. Did you look into this? Did you look into that? And we want to remind people that when we first broke this case, which was, I think it was like the second week of December, our initial call out was to ask people's help in identifying the source of these lights. Okay, we said nothing about alien origins, about alien invasions. I know there's been comments out there, from some people, and I think it's kind of rather immature and demeaning, personally, to imply that, dozens of witnesses who have seen similar UAPs, and we are calling them unidentified area phenomena, in the area were ignorant or should have known what they were looking at, right? Something mundane. So we'll get into that in a minute. There is something I think that initially when you watch these videos, and we'll pull the first one up right here, you do get some sense that we're looking at a light anomaly. So whether it's, an actual object that's illuminating light against the clouds, or it's actually just being projected against the clouds, you can see the first wave there. They zoom across the horizon really, really fast, and then that second wave comes. It takes several more seconds of 4 lights, and a 5th light kind of slips into place into this empty slot of a formation. Now, again, this is toward West Bend, a very rural area of Wisconsin. It's December 1st. I think it was about, 10:50 p.m., and there's a car coming up the road there. But, the 2 waves, astonished Kim and her husband were the witnesses in this one. And what's really important in their case is that we take this into context to what happened right before Kim and her husband witnessed this, and seeing what they described at first were owls, looked like owls, right? And Brittany, you talked to them, and they still maintain today, right, that what they first saw, they not 100% certain that it was connected to what they then filmed or recorded in the sky, but it was something so strange that these things came down to ground level, correct? And were basically in front of their headlights.
Yep, from tree level in front of the car, and then back up on the other side. 4 times.
So keep that in mind, that we're trying to look at this from kind of 2 perspectives. That possibly these orbish lights they were seeing that were down at ground level may or may not be related to what was later recorded in the sky. Okay, and then we have Ken. So here's Ken's video. And Ken is in the town of Fredonia, a much smaller town about 5 miles exactly northeast of Kim. And he's going out to get his mail. He's former law enforcement, sees some things flying around the sky, so he pulls out his phone and he points it in that direction, and he gets that first wave that Kim and her husband were seeing, zooms across, and about 7 to 8 seconds later, you get that second wave. Not only does it look precisely what Kim and her husband recorded, but the timestamps on their phones line up almost to the exact second. There's no doubt that they're looking at the same event. It's just that Ken, in this case, is closer to it. As we kind of scrub this back and forth, you see that there's a flash. There's kind of this weird flash of light that happens in the distance after the first wave. And then that second wave takes several more seconds to go by. And you got your 4 lights, and that 5th light comes in from the left side of the screen and kind of slips into place, which was really, really odd. So let's take a moment here and discuss why we felt these recorded events, the eyewitness testimony, could not simply be dismissed, right away as conventional search beams or the type of spotlights you might use in an advertising event or use in a concert or show. So in the 2 weeks before we issued the first report, not one of the lighting industry experts we talked to felt comfortable declaring that they could identify what kind of spotlight could do everything we're seeing in the videos and where they took place. That wasn't us saying it. We relied on their expertise and still do. While we don't think anyone could deny, if you look at the lights, they seem to follow the contours of the cloud deck above, as if it were caused by a ground projection. That conclusion does not necessarily follow as true 100% of the time, because certainly there's examples of solid objects that can emanate light. They can also reflect off clouds like aircraft with its lights on, rockets, missiles, etc. Now, obviously, it's really unlikely aircraft could do what we're seeing, and we certainly hope these aren't missiles. So we focus most of our efforts on trying to determine what kind of spotlights these could be. But here's the main factors we felt just didn't add up with the information we had so far. Again, you can go back to our first video report, where we covered much of this in greater detail. But to summarize, one of our biggest issues was the intensity of the lights. Okay, so we don't always see the beams, the physical beams associated with the light, but it depends on the weather conditions, and these were really, really intense. Now, the distances, again, you've got Kim, who's out almost 11 miles away from what we'll talk about here, the Flanders lights, which is the main thing people are focusing on. But you have this huge distance involved in the types of lights. All of our industry experts are saying they could go out a couple miles, but not over 6, 8, 10 miles. They couldn't figure out how that type of beam could also do, as you see here, number 2, could move around very quickly. Because the arc beam, carbon arc lights, the huge ones that have the huge reflectors, have to be manually moved, and they don't move around like the stage and DJ lights you see in concerts. And then those ones, of course, don't have the distance. The maneuvering of that 5th light that came in the formation is not typical of a program show. So we explored that in great detail. You'll see here where people buy programs and download them so it automates their lighting systems, but it's not a typical thing that you would put in a lighting show. It looks very strange, like there's a formation, in an empty spot and the light flies into place. Again, this is a very rural area. The population we discussed in the last video is, in the couple thousands of most of these small towns where they don't use commercial advertising for this type of thing, and it requires a permit. You have to go to City Hall, you have to get permits, you're supposed to, and nobody did that. We looked at all this within the 2 weeks, and nobody had applied for permits, and the people at City Hall that should know if these things are going on knew nothing about any commercial advertising. And then finally, we have these eyewitnesses like Kim and her husband, and another one we'll talk about at the end here, who came forward and said they had, right before seeing the things that people are describing in the sky, they saw orbish. They was described as orbish lights that came down to ground level. Okay, in both cases around their vehicles, sometimes as close as 30 feet. 30 feet in the air, 30 feet away from the car. So we can't simply dismiss, that is like inaccurate or that they were making that up. It may or may not be connected to the phenomena that was recorded, but because of all these reasons, we felt these videos were quite compelling, and they required more than a 5-minute, cursory look and then just declare that they were spotlights. So now we have some fairly confident assessments that we can make on the case. We hope that you appreciate why we couldn't be satisfied with theories that presented plausible, albeit mostly circumstantial evidence, when we still had so many unanswered questions. We're providing this update because our commitment, first of all, to the community, okay, in Fredonia and Belgium and Wisconsin and the other parts that we have been talking to witnesses. And secondly, because we want to remind the audience, as we always do, that we have no agenda in this. Most of what we report are developing stories, and that means that new information is coming in daily. So if that information changes, what theory becomes a predominant theory, and if we're able to identify, for example, that these are searchlights or they're coming from a specific location, we really don't care. I mean, I don't know how to convey that to people. Like, we go where the facts lead us, And it's kind of really frustrating when people want us to choose a side or they choose a side. We're in this because we're curious, because things didn't add up, and we just go where it takes us.
Yeah, and I agree, Ben. I think with this type of investigation and how it all played out and the amount that was coming in almost daily following our ground investigation, it needs to be a level up. And for the locals and that community, we were trying to provide that for them. And with this particular case, it really needed that. We really needed to give a deep dive and to figure it out.
Yeah, it really is a deep dive. And if you're waiting for us to say anything about aliens or that these are interdimensional beings, then you might as well just stop watching, okay? Because that is not the conclusion. But if you care to watch the whole thing, it also means we're going to provide you as much detail as possible. Even if it doesn't support the principal theory that we're working from, it means that we agree with theories which we might have initially disagreed with if the facts later bear out that it's more one way or another. So in criminal law, we call this, revealing the exculpatory evidence. We just call it transparency. We think it's a real shame when people choose to take sides and enjoy pitting, one researcher against another as if this was some sort of gladiator style event, when we should be working alongside each other, if it's really worth finding the truth. At any rate, enough about that. All right, jumping right into this. So from the beginning, our primary focus has always been to determine if any type of searchlight was capable of doing all the things that were witnessed both in the videos on December 1st and the events that happened on the road by the witnesses Kim and her husband prior to them actually recording the aerial event. So Brittany, could you kind of recap for us? I know we've talked now to how many lighting experts. We've also talked to the distributors, of these lights, and explaining kind of like the crux of the problem really was trying to find if there's a type of light that can do the movement and still provide the intensity we saw in the videos, right?
Yeah, so to recap quickly, looking back when we first got the videos, we really needed to figure out what kind of light would do this type of projection over the distance that we were having our eyewitnesses sending and documenting these lights. And with that in mind, looking at what we knew, or based on what we knew from our own history of working in shows, we kind of already had an idea. You and I both did. However, with the way technology is nowadays, we just really wanted to get kind of a better understanding, have a better foundation where to start. And so I reached out to several different lighting companies, anywhere from, we're talking companies that still ran with the original arc lights that you're familiar with, Ben, that you've used in the past, all the way up to new technology stage lights. And I, of course, provided the videos. We had long conversations, and this was multiple individuals all the way from Las Vegas, all the way here to Florida, that work anywhere from theme parks to large concert series shows to whatever the production value. I needed to know what I was looking for to help our investigation. And based off the video alone, pretty much each one of them had come back and said, the first thing I would look for is like a car dealership, because these look more like sky trackers, something we might use in Vegas, which was one individual I spoke to who is familiar with the lights used in Vegas. And I, again, explained that this location was in the rural part of Wisconsin. I even showed them on the map how rural it was. And that kind of was confusing to them because there was no large location that would house basically a 4 type of bulb unit ahead of these, like the cannons, like the sky trackers. They didn't, to have something like that, they broke it down to me on how much power they would need through a generator, and a lot of those come out on trailers, and there's a whole breakdown with those.
And was this the NASA company? And by NASA, it's not NASA, the space agency. That's the name of they're like the premier distributor and experts. Everyone was telling us, talk to the guys at NASA, right?
Yeah, everybody pointed there that those were the guys for the U.S. Like, go talk to them in regards. If you're looking for sky trackers, the big cannons, talk to them. And I had a wonderful conversation with them. They were very helpful. And of course, I did provide them the videos. But again, it was very much like the same response we were getting. Yeah, those are large cannon lights, 4,000 to 7,000 watt bulbs, and they would break down the type of wattage and how they would work and function, and motorized heads. However, the speed isn't that fast because of the size. So there was a lot that we had to take into consideration. But in the very beginning, this was probably day 3 after receiving the very first video, first videos, I should say, at that point. You and I both had an understanding that this was going to be a sky tracker type situation, a large base Canon type projection light at some type of event or something to look for. And that's really when I put my feet down and started looking for an event that would have such a large Canon light on display that could be seen for several miles.
Yeah, and reminding people too, again, this is a very rural area of Wisconsin, and like having, like you said, the place to house them. Why would you do it? To buy them, tens of thousands of dollars if you're to buy a sky tracker, set and generators and everything be required, and so that didn't make sense. But the top priority was, what is capable of doing this, right? And so then you started to look out, and I say you because you did the bulk of the legwork here and calling people up and doing all that. So you started, this was 2 weeks before we released the report. You spent a lot of hours tracking down every possible outdoor Christmas event. I remember you telling me, well, there's this one over here. There's a park display that's in the area, a Rotary Club, everything basically like within a 20-mile radius, right?
Oh yeah, they had lights all the way down on Lake Michigan, outside of Belgium, that you could actually watch on a live webcam as you're heading more north, or I'm sorry, more south. And I just wasn't sure in the direction on, if we're looking for a large base Canon, how far basically the projection could go. So if I'm looking at it anywhere within that stretch of a mile, I'm going to look at all the festivities that are happening. And I also looked into high schools to see if there was any high school football games going on or any type of function that was happening at a high school, as well as a town hall with a wedding or a special event. Because sometimes some of those venues and those locations, they will buy really big lights depending on who's getting married, and if it's their daughter's big wedding, and that's maybe something she wanted. So you have to take everything into consideration. So I not only looked into Christmas lights, but I looked into all different types of festivals or festivities that may or may not have been going on around those dates to try and figure out, did you or did you not have any type of projection lights during your event? And everything turned up no. I'm
Which
sorry.
Which is an odd question, right? People are like, why are you asking?
Oh my God.
Right? Because not many people saw this.
No. That phone call was always very interesting. Hi,
right.
I'm going to see if you have lights because we're getting strange anomalous lights being seen in the sky.
We're calling from the Department of Skylighting, and you're in violation, or like, why are you calling me, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's when you came upon the Flanders. So this is all within 2 weeks. People wondering why, what we knew within 2 weeks before we even issued the first report. We want you to know that a lot happened for us to vet different sources and things. And you came across the Flanders Family Christmas Show.
Yeah, that was in the first 3 days of my investigation of light shows in the area. And I reached out to all of them on that day. Yeah. So
the Flanders family was very cordial. They provided us with the exact brand and model of the lights that we're using, right, on that day and since they've been using. So I'm going to pull that up right here so that everyone can see. We were given basically a brand name, and later we learned exactly where they bought it. They actually bought, 4 of these lights on AliExpress, and another, 2 lights, something like that, on a different website. I think it was because they just weren't all available in that quantity. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it came from 2 different distributors.
2 different distributors. This one is on from a store called Blue Show, and it is 380 watt DMX moving head light beam, and it's this exact model here. And they bought 6 of these. So when we first looked at this, and we went into the specs and we talked to our experts in the lighting industry. This is similar to a type of light that's known as a Sharpie. Okay, so the Sharpie is a moving head. It was described as a DJ or stage light. So it's not even really well known as an outdoor light. You can use them for concerts, obviously. But the more, this is more kind of like, what would you say, a prosumer version right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It comes from China. It's not nearly as powerful as a lot of the ones that they do for big concerts. In talking to our industry experts, they agreed, and some of them actually said this does look like something that a Sharpie light is capable of doing and whipping around, and it feels that way. However, the problem they had, which we still have, is that the distances were so extreme. Not one of them said, "Oh yeah, it could do that." They were like, "Yeah, these are not designed for that," and especially that it came from a Chinese distributor where they're not known for giving, I guess we could say the correct specs. Is that right, Brittany? I mean, we ran into
Yeah.
that, right?
Really that a lot. Very confusing with specs on each of these. Yeah.
So for that reason, we put it off to the side and we said, yeah, it's one of the many possibilities, but it's not something that we specifically said. We talked to Flanders because, again, we talked to many people. We talked to, I'd say, half a dozen at least that you had called or emailed and tried to directly find out what they were using. So
Yeah.
would you say that's accurate?
I would say so. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe a little higher than that, but in the first couple of days, yeah, I would definitely say so.
All right. So after we released the first report, and asked for help in identifying the source, the Flanders quickly became, by many, as the primary location of interest. So, to demonstrate why we didn't believe this to be likely, we coordinated with volunteers. Okay, not doing one, but I think we're up to 5 or 6 now, separate
Yep.
recreation attempts to the farm.
Yep.
So to show you a little bit of that and not spend too much time on it, I want to play the videos that were taken at, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've got videos showing it, it's like 1.5 miles, 3, and then
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
5.5. Okay, it's kind of pointless to show you at 1.5 because, yeah, the lights are right there. They're still relatively intense. But here's what it looks like at 5 miles. So this is measured by GPS 5 miles away from Flanders' home. You can see it's a relatively clear night. And we did these types of tests from anywhere from a cloud deck of like 1,400 feet up to 8,000, trying to get a variety of different weather conditions. In this one, there's barely any clouds, but you can see way out there in the distance, the beam is definitely visible. You can see sort of the point at which it begins, although we'll discuss in a minute, you can't humanly see past 3 and a bit miles on the horizon. You can see that there is a beam because that's higher up in the sky. But because there's no cloud deck, you don't see a real spot. So look though right here, the beam and how the width of it diverges. Even though the beam is pretty narrow, it's only a few degrees, you can see how quickly away from the source it is wide. I mean, it spreads way out there. And then also because the weather's clear, you get a sense that the beam throw, we call it, how far out that would go. It's kind of hard to tell without clouds though. So here's this other video, and this one is 5.5 miles. A different volunteer helped us film this one, and it's a little bit more intense. You can see that there are some clouds at this point, and so you're seeing the spots coming off the cloud deck. Now, I'll admit, I didn't think you'd be able to see the actual beams that intensely. By the way, all the tests, in every case, you'd always see a beam. There were never just the spots, but I didn't think you'd see them this intensely from 5.5 miles out. But the point is this: the contention was never that you would be able to see spotlights for several miles out. You see them in the horizon. There's a big difference between seeing these and seeing that there's something projecting up. And in this case, it looks like more like a 45-degree angle or more. But there's a lot of distance between the beam and the observer. They don't come over your head. They stay out there. They're in the distant horizon. They're small, but you do see them on the cloud layer. Okay. Now that we've established that. It was about that time when we're having people go out and do these recreations that we received a third witness video. I'm going to show this to you here. This video comes from a a lady who lives in Belgium. So actually, before we do that, let me pull up the map. Here is Fredonia, which is the kind of the center of, I guess you could say, of everything that's going on here, because way over here we have Kim, witness Kim, and then we have witness Ken, who's over here. Okay, so Fredonia is kind of in the middle. And then if we go further east out towards Lake Michigan, we have Aaron, who is the third witness. Okay, now putting Flanders Family Farm right in the middle here, you kind of get a sense of the different angles that are involved. Okay, so Kim would be seeing from here at roughly, it's not quite due east. It's probably more like of a 70-something degree heading, and then Ken is looking at more of a, I would just guess probably 100 degrees or so coming down here. And then Aaron sees something from the back side. Here's what she saw. So it's at the same time on December 1st. She's looking southwest. She sees these lights that are going around in circles, takes her phone out, and you're going to see the same two waves. And we think that they are the same two waves because there's one here that's just kind of the fast first one, and then again, 7-point-something seconds later, the slower wave comes through. Now, it's really kind of difficult to see here, but as we scrub this backwards and forwards, you can kind of make out that if you count the number of lights, it's kind of hard to see, but it looks like 4 lights, and then a 5th light comes from the right and slides into place. Let's see if I can kind of isolate that for you so you can see it. That might be that 5th light that was a little bit late to the party, but Erin's seeing it in reverse because she's on the back side of it, so it comes from the right and not from the left. So one thing that was really cool about Erin's video is that she had the moon in the shot. And we can go back to archival data, which we did, and we found actually where the moon was exactly that night. Here it is. We can find the elevation of it was actually about 10 degrees off the horizon, and it was a heading of 246 degrees from Belgium, the city there. Okay, so again, just quickly going back to the map. So from Erin's location, and if you were to draw a line from Erin down to Flanders, you're looking at about 4 miles away. And it turns out, I don't have that here up on your screen, but it turns out that that is 246 degrees. Very, very close. Okay, so what does that mean? Lining up the 3 videos now, it makes a very good case for Flanders as having been the source of this event, the one on December 1st. But there's more to it. Before moving on, Mick West should be happy to know that his hunch is most likely correct, at least as far as how the lights line up and the similar movements that we'll go into in a minute. Although he did make his initial declaration with only minutes of seeing Ken's video on Twitter, said that there were obviously spotlights, we don't doubt that he later spent some considerable time looking into possible sources, contributing to the investigation. And anybody who does that without getting paid in our book deserves credit where credit is due. Now, having said that, we felt like there still were and are unanswered questions surrounding a 100% definitive conclusion on the case, and we feel that we have to note these. So let's begin with this odd movement of that 5th light that kind of slides into place. Now, Brittany, you talked to one lighting expert, and what was his initial feeling on that?
Well, when we first discussed this, again, we were talking and looking for searchlights. So I went back to a lot of the experts that we were talking to at the beginning. And once we went over this video based on the lights that they had, and I asked.
And that's when you found that distributor, right? I mean, this guy sells more the higher end stuff, not really what you buy in AliExpress, but he felt that it was probably stage lighting and definitely could be that movement because he said that it was like the automation they used to upload to these things and tell the movement that it could have been an error. Maybe the user, however it was done, had an error in the programming.
And so with that in mind, I immediately went back to you and said, okay, what we're looking at in the video, even though as strange as it is, it looks and it would appear that it's a glitch in the system or programming glitch. But again, we're unsure of how that would be. at that time, looking at the larger lights, but now looking at like a studio concert light setting, it would have been a glitch in the computer system.
So that seemed pretty reasonable to us. I mean, not only could this be some sort of a programming problem, it's not communicating the right movements to the device, but also a physical impediment. So if Flanders was up there working on the roof and he bumped the light, or he was in the way of the motor, gimbal, moving, as soon as he moves out of the way, it's going to try and catch up and to sync with the rest of the program. So both of those things are possible, and that was very useful information for us. We did feel, however, at this point, we needed to recontact Flanders to see if they use that sort of movement in their shows, right? Because it's the same show that they play over and over. And we also wanted to know exactly when did they put these lights up. So Brittany, what did he tell us at that point?
So he got them as far back as July, but never touched them or worked with them until the first time was like one random day in August, just to see, because he said there was no instructions in the box. So he was trying to like figure out how they worked, how they were mounted, and so on. And then he played with them on November 26th. And then he worked with them the evening after show on December 1st. But the lights were not actually in the show and placed. They were mounted on the house, but they were not actually working in the show and doing songs in the show of his light show until December 10th.
And that was something really new to us. We had just assumed that those lights were always being used, right, from December 1st or whenever a later part of November, and that they were always part of the show, but they weren't. And so that night, they weren't being used at all until he turned them on and did say that he was making a tweak to them about 20 minutes after the show. So that should put it about 10:50, okay?
Yep.
He, at that point, too, also told us exactly where he downloaded and purchased the rights and the programming for the songs that he uses these. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he uses those lights in 4 of the different songs. And there was it 4 or 3? Okay, 3 of the songs, but he only had 2 of them December 1st that he was kind of messing around and playing. So we're going to just go to that website, and I want to show you because it's really cool. They have an animation on the website that shows exactly what those lights are going to be doing. So you can go check it out yourself if you want. You go to pixelprodisplays.com and you can go to search the song Frozen, which is one of the favorite songs of my 2 little sons. And as we watch this, Brittany will give us her rendition of Let It Go.
Oh, sure.
Or maybe not.
No.
Well, it turns out that Let It Go was the only song of the 2 songs he had at the time that matches up and has this type of movement, which I'll show you towards the end. So, I mean, you can play it through if you want. You can see the 6 lights, which is what he had on top of his. Let's actually make this just larger. You can see the whole thing here. And you can see that the house and whatever you got going on down here, is not what you're purchasing. You're purchasing this. And you can see how the lights move in kind of wave-like motions and earlier on in the song. But they don't do anything similar to the movement that we see in the video until the very end. And so I'm going to move that forward. And something I learned was that they call this move, for those who are lighting aficionados, they call this the kilt move, the kilt maneuver. Okay, so if you have your 6 lights lined up like this, what happens is they come down and they fan out like the pleats. Is that a word? A pleat? The pleating?
Yeah.
The pleats. Okay. If your kilt is pleated, they come down and they start out. Let's see if I can find exactly where it is here. We'll just play it from here. There's going to be 2 waves of this, and it starts out. They're kind of strobing here, and then they're all going to kind of come down and line up. Okay, they do a little thing here. Classic, kind of a search beam thing. Okay, and then they're going to do this rapid movement. So they're going to line up, and there's only like 30 seconds left in the show here. Okay, so they're going to come down. Sorry, they strobe first. And they're going to go up fast. And then 7 to 8 seconds later, they do a slow kilt maneuver with 6 lights. Okay, but let me point something out here. Right here, this is the exact same display that you would see if you purchased this and programmed your lights. It's a little bit hard to tell the exact angle, but when they come up there, they turn on, I would say really at no more than a 45-degree angle. It's pretty much the whole show and all the songs, the lights are either nearly straight up, or in this case, they do angle down, but they don't start turning on until about 45 degrees off the horizon and then slowly rise up. And we're later going to see why that angle is kind of problematic when it reaches out horizontally to 10 miles. So the Flanders also clarified that what he conveyed to Mick West, or meant to convey, was that he felt that the December 1st videos could be his lighting display, but he's far from certain. We got that hesitancy, so we wanted to know exactly what he thought, having seen the videos. We weren't sure if he'd actually seen the witness videos yet. He hadn't really reviewed the distances, so when we told him what the distances were involved, he was very skeptical that it could be his lights. He also pointed out how small these halide bulbs are in these units, and that's kind of what baffled him. He's like, people don't understand how small these things are, and that my lights could go 10 miles. I don't know, maybe. So that's kind of where he was.
I just want to also add to that, Ben, and as a kind of a quick follow-up to that, if you remember when we were talking to Ken, one of our witnesses, he also mentioned that he had seen lights back in October, and they almost were chasing each other.
That's right.
In a pattern. And then we also had another individual who had came forward who said that they had seen them at 3 a.m. in the morning on December 1st. And so when we had those accounts in play, and when we were starting to have a really good open conversation with the Flanders and his willingness to help so much, I really wanted to get a timestamp. And I wanted to know, were you working on these lights back in October? And he had mentioned, no, I didn't start playing with them after my first August time until November 26th, which he has almost, it seems like he has all this written down and is really familiar. And it's probably based because of being that these were lights and a light show, and there might be rules and regulations in the town. I'm thinking he was considering those. So then I also asked, well, have you ever played with them all the way up to like 3 a.m. in the morning, or even on December 1st when you were kind of working with them for a brief moment? Did you happen to work on them at 3 a.m.? And he told me no. I ran 2 songs and I called it for the night. So the 3 a.m. one, still, that gentleman explained the lights were similar to what Kim and Ken had seen. So that's kind of, again, it's perplexing, and it puts another, like, right when you think you might be on the right path, it jerks you the whole other direction.
Yeah, absolutely. So at this point, we're pretty confident that we have movement that looks like the Flanders lights. The angle is definitely off. We have some lights that are seen earlier than he was messing with them, later in the night than he was tweaking with them the December 1st night. So is there something else here? Is there somebody else who has a type of light, something that might be being used? So at this point, this happened, about 2 weeks ago. We reached out again to these different distributors on AliExpress and places where the lights were actually purchased, and I was getting conflicting specs. So I want to pull one of those up here for you just to give you an idea. Now, on the specification page of that actual light, you can see that it doesn't say anything. It says what kind of bulb is being used, and it's 380 watts. Here we have the angle of the light, which goes from 1.9 to 3 degrees. That's the beam spread, and that becomes important here in a minute. But there's nothing about lumens or lux or anything like that. So when I reached out to them, one person who sells the light told me that it puts out 300,000 lumens. Okay, and man, that is a huge light. Okay, 300,000 lumens. I couldn't find anywhere online that puts out a 300,000 lumen spotlight unless it's a wattage of something like 1200 watts or something. Okay, so that was kind of like, I don't know about that. And another one told me, well, actually we can pull this up here, the lux chart, was provided with theirs. And you can see here, this cone shows you the beam spread, and it can be spread from 8 degrees out to 34 degrees. So one problem with that, of course, is that the lights that Flanders had can go down to 1.9. So it is going to be a more powerful directed beam. But we do get a good idea. If you look here at the top, 120,000 lux. This is the inverse square law in what we use with lighting. So every time you double the distance, it's proportional to the square root. And it's very geeky technical stuff. But basically, that means 240,000 lux at 1 meter. Okay, so at this point, I think that we were kind of, in the ballpark, and we're getting somewhere, but we still weren't satisfied with it. And I felt as if we couldn't make any definitive conclusions unless we tested the actual lights that Flanders has. So what we did is we had some volunteers go out, and Flanders agreed to this, a really great family. And we sent them out there with a light meter. So I think it was January 3rd, after their show had ended. Flanders is able to control the lights from inside, so we didn't have to take them off the roof. We didn't want to bother him doing that. But we had him angle the lights downward, and you can see here kind of the setup that was used, putting it on a tripod and mounting it, and then going outside, and they took several measurements at different distances. Then we averaged out those numbers to get an indicated lux for that light fixture. Not going to go into the difference between lux and lumens here, but the lux basically is the light illumination when the light is in the fixture and how much light you're actually getting, based by the reflector and everything else. Anyways, using formulas they used in the lighting industry, we were able to calculate the beam throw. So this is basically the point where the lux reduces to 0 or is not visible by the human eye, let alone an iPhone. So this is where we brought in another lighting industry expert named Matt Ford. Now, he's won 2 Emmys for his lighting design. I feel bad. I didn't even know they gave Emmys for that. But he's been nominated for several others. And he's done everything from, the Jimmy Kimmel Show to concerts to American Idol. He knows what is out there and what's possible with lights. He uses these formulas all the time. And so we asked him to take a look at this. He was able to find similar lights that he uses in his industry. They're kind of somewhat stronger, to be honest. And to take those specs and those lights and then calculate the maximum throw distance would be for that type of light, like I said, commonly known as the Sharpie. Now, I did the same thing with the measurements that we took from Flanders' actual light. All right. So what we did is we came up with kind of a range of what he said and what we got, because we wanted to make sure if ours weren't exactly accurate, out in the field. And Matt came up with a throw distance of 20,000 feet. And here's a little graphic that we made up. So the cloud ceiling here is at 6,500 feet. And this little fixture over here is Flanders, the home with a light mounted on the top of it. And the throw distance at 20,000 feet places that little elliptical thing there. That's the spot. And this actually is pretty much to scale. I spent a lot of time doing it to scale, except for the witnesses. They would not be that huge. They would be like 1 pixel. Okay, so you wouldn't even see them on this. But 20,000 feet up is the max throw distance. Okay. If you had that cloud ceiling of 6,500 feet, this is where it's going to end. Now, if you put our first witness, Ken, way over here, 6.75 miles away. Okay. In other words, we'll show you the trigonometry here in a second and how far that is in feet. But you get a visual of, let's call this the hypothetical throw distance if that light were to appear not only above Ken's head, but to go behind him. Because you remember in the video, and what he said is the lights came from starting behind him and then came over his head. And that spot, that huge elongated spot, is how much it is going to spread out. And we will touch on that in a minute to show you with distance increase and how big that spot gets and how far away it is, that is quite a distance from what we projected. Now, my estimate was actually 16,000 something, so it put it closer. But we want this to be, in all fairness, the most conservative type of estimate that you could make. So we don't want to say anything just to make it try to fit, our point. We're taking the max, of what was estimated would be 20,000 feet that could be seen. And again, remembering that both the manufacturers and distributors themselves were telling us, I think one of them told me 1,000 meters. And I'm like, are they underreporting the distance because they don't want to get in trouble with regulations? Right. Another one told me 700 feet. I mean, didn't one of the lighting experts bring something like that up, Britt?
They did. Yeah, they talked about how that's a struggle right now in the industry dealing with lights coming from Japan or from China because they're quick market and they're turning around, so they're not necessarily up to U.S. codes. So when they come over here, they're having a little bit of kind of a light difficulty, especially in concerts and shows, and how bright they are or how not bright they are. They're just not up to our standard and codes. So it's a lot different versus from over there to here of what they're dealing with in the shipments, because you can get them on Amazon now, right from there.
Yeah, and our final point that we'll make here towards the end addresses that in the fact that we didn't feel comfortable we were getting the right specs. That's why we measured it ourselves. That's another reason this has taken over a month to do. Yeah. But I feel pretty confident in that assessment that these things are not going to go over 20,000 feet. Now, I'll make this point the first time, and then we'll do it again at the end. But people need to understand there's a big difference between seeing a light at, let's say, Ken is 6.75 miles away. We just showed you videos where people were seeing them at 5.5. That's not much further. But there's a big difference between seeing a light at the horizon and seeing that there's something in the sky and you see beam and you see spots on the clouds versus that dim light when you pull it back to 7, 8, 9, 10 miles and having that come over your head and create intense beams. Well, in this case, not the beams, but just the spots above you. All right, so keep that in mind. Okay, now that we have some numbers, we can actually use some trigonometry to figure out the hypothetical throw distance. So here we have the ground level, and let's, not exactly straight, but let's draw a light fixture here. And this is the ground, and we have 6.75 miles between Flanders. Okay, we'll just call that F over here. And then our little stick figure guy, that's Ken. Okay, so he's 6.75 miles away from Flanders. Now this is a right angle, and the distance from the ground, AGL, to the cloud base is 6,500 feet. So why don't we draw some little clouds up here? Okay, cool. So now we can figure out this angle, the hypotenuse here, which turns out to be 36,228 feet. Okay, that's because down here, if you wanted to know, 6.75 miles turns out to be 35,640, something like that. All right, so this is the hypothetical distance that light beam would have to travel in order to be directly above Ken's perspective over here. So 36,228 feet. That is a lot further than the max throw distance we had estimated at 20,000 feet. Also, because of that, we can also use the trig to figure out this angle, which comes out to be 10.3 degrees. So that would be the angle that the light fixture had to be pointing at from the top of Flanders' house in order to reach the cloud base above Ken. And remember when we were looking at that and saying, that's kind of like a 45-degree angle when it has that part in the song where it comes down and the lights actually turn on as it comes back up and does the kilt maneuver. Well, it certainly, in my opinion, did not look like it turned on at 10 degrees. Could it have? Yeah, but that's a really, really shallow angle. All right, now take a look at this. We also talked about the beam size, the spot size of that beam. And if we draw a little fixture here, let's say that's our light, and we're looking from a top-down, sort of a bird's eye view, and here's the center of that beam, let's say. Well, if you go off the manufacturer's specs, it says that that type of light, the exact light, is from 1.9 degrees to 3 degrees in span of the beam width. In other words, let's say we'll go off to the left. This is not to scale, by the way. And go off to the right. That's how far that beam will spread. And as it goes out, the distance, which we now know, the throw distance is 36,200 and something odd feet here. By the time it reaches that, the end of its beam length, or the cloud layer, okay, we have this spot now. If it were a perfect circle, remember, this is if it's hitting it at a 90 degree, a perpendicular angle to whatever it's projecting on. The width of that circle, or the diameter, is going to be 1,239 feet. That's about a quarter of a mile wide. All right, now we know, though, however, it doesn't make a perfect circle, because when you've got your cloud layer here, and that beam is projecting up towards the clouds, it elongates it. So we did that calculation as well. So you can see the ellipse there on the right-hand side and the perfect circle on the left-hand side. And the slant angle is 10.3 degrees. So that's the angle at which the beam contacts the surface of the cloud. And that's what causes it to elongate out. It actually keeps the same width, but it's the length of it that gets stretched. Two things there. Number one, the song that was playing that would match what the kilt maneuver was, right, and how the lights go up, that angle really, and even I think as we're talking to Flanders, didn't believe that his lights came down. They're capable of doing that, yes, but to come down in that maneuver, it starts at about what looks like a 45-degree angle, not way down to 10 degrees. It would have to go that low. It would have to go that low in order to reach the 8 and the 10 miles and to go out that far, okay, just because of the trigonometry involved here. And then the second thing is the shape of that beam. So as I said, as it elongates out, the math says that spot would be 6,539 feet long. That's 1.25 miles. It still maintains the width, but as it stretches out, you now have, you can see here down at the bottom, instead of 1.2 million square feet, you have 6.36 million square feet of coverage of light. And when you increase by over 5 times the surface that light is projecting to, it diminishes exponentially the luminosity that's available. And I was thinking of an analogy, and the closest thing I could think of is if you're given some toast and a certain amount of butter, and someone says, butter this toast, right? You're like, okay, I covered the toast. But then I give you a baguette, it's like twice the size of it. And it's sort of elliptical, and you're like, now butter it with the same amount. Well, that butter is now spread out much more thinly, and you're going to have people like my 4-year-old who are not happy because he wants the butter to be everywhere, right? So, you like that analogy?
I do, actually.
You do?
Yeah, it makes sense.
I just came up with it just now. Okay, well, anyways, if you take those elliptical shapes and you overlay them over Ken's video, now I kept the width of the ellipse the same. The length is going to look longer, obviously, because we're not seeing this in 3 dimensions against the cloud deck, and it's not slanted, so that would shorten what they look like from our view. But anyways, what we're really concerned about is the space between those lights. So from the far left light to the far right, if that beam spread goes out to that distance, you know, we're talking nearly 7 miles at Ken's and over 10, almost 11 miles at Kim's, you get a span of more than 8 miles overhead. 8 miles. Now that's more than just a rough estimate. I mean, that should be pretty accurate based on how far that was thrown and the beam and what it would look like now. And one other thing, I'm just going to throw this in there. I found it very interesting that the human eye, if you have a 6-foot person, because the way the curvature of the earth is, 6 feet tall, you can see approximately 3.24 miles to the horizon. So here's this little graphic here. That yellow dome is that 3.24 miles to the horizon. Now, that doesn't mean you can't see through the dome at things up in the air. I mean, that's why we see satellites that, thousands of miles away. But what it means is anything towards the ground, can't be seen past 3.24 miles unless you're at an elevated altitude. And it gives you somewhat of an idea of the expanse of how far out this 8.23 miles is when you line up all 5 lights, and how much of that, of your horizon above you in the sky, how much that takes up. Now, if you point an iPhone at the sky, that I don't think would fit in your frame at all, because you'd be having to pan from one side all the way over to the other to enclose 8 miles. And we can test that theory too, because Ken gave us not only his nighttime footage, but a daytime comparison. And you overlay that, and you can clearly pick out some landmarks now, and you can see the field of view of his camera, because you see the grove of trees and the things in his frame. We can now plot lines from Google Earth, and you can see, if we extend that out now, what his camera field of view is going to be seeing. And now let's say we make one of those lines out to 6,800 feet. Why 6,800? Why not 6,500, the cloud deck? Well, yeah, it would be exactly 6,500 above him, but he's seeing this, the frame we're using is in front of him, so it's that hypotenuse throw distance. Anyways, it's within the ballpark. And so if we extend these lines outward now, and you've got them going out to, theoretically, it's the cloud deck. It's not going to be to infinity. Right here is that span. That's that distance between the left, right, all the way to the right light, and it comes out to be 5,780. Now, even if that was a little more off, and let's give it a couple thousand more feet, you're still talking 5,700 is just over, a mile and a bit. It's not 8 miles. And that's the big difference there. If these lights were coming from Flanders from that distance and that span, then would they fit inside the frame of Ken's camera? And that's another reason we have a big problem. So what are we left with? If it was Flanders lights from December 1st, and we're still saying that it most likely was, people need to understand how highly unusual and what a fluke coincidence it was, possibly with the weather conditions, to have to be so exact with the cloud coverage, visibility, etc., to not be seen from that distance. It's not just our opinion. We talked to some other people. Mark D'Antonio is a good friend. He's MUFON's chief photo analyst. He's also an astronomer, and he double checked the math, and he says, well, the math is sound. What you're talking about, if all that is true. And then I actually messed with the cloud layers. I was like, let's suppose it's down to 1,000 feet, right? Or let's suppose it's 8,000 feet. And what happens? You don't affect that throw distance by very much at all. If you take it up to 8,000 feet, you got a longer throw reach that it has to go, but you have less, call it distortion of the beam. Beam spot is smaller, and so it'd be more intense, but it's like a canceling effect. If you take it down to 1,000 feet with the cloud level, then you're never going to get shorter than 6.75 miles. It's not going to be any shorter than that. So you still have that long distance to cover. And now you have a bigger surface area. So it's just, we could go on and on about the problems with it. But the point is, not even our lighting industry experts expected this, and they're struggling to accept it. So for those who suggest that our witnesses are ignorant for not recognizing simple searchlights, such people probably actually know less about the matter than the average person, because a lot of these witnesses spent a lot of time, many, many hours researching, asking questions themselves as to why the aspects of the events didn't make sense. So to
Yeah.
summarize this, that distance problem has not been demonstrated through experiments or data predictions that it's clearly the answer, being, the Flanders. But if we had to put money on it, at least for me, the family, Christmas show is most likely the source of the lights. And I know, Brittany, you agree with me. The Flanders have been through quite a lot, right?
Yeah.
You've
Oh, yeah.
talked to them a couple times. I have, several times. They're very humble people, very cordial, doing anything to help us out, right? Their
Yeah.
name and event were suddenly kind of thrust into the national media. There's been dozens of articles around the globe, New York Post to People Magazine. We think it's a little bit unfair because some of these articles, I guess you could say they've sort of slandered the Flanders, right? It's kind of like, they're responsible for this, but it
Yeah.
wasn't their desire to be the source of the controversy, especially because of the good cause that this year's event goes towards. And so for their
Right.
trouble, we wanted to make sure that people know that all of the donations that they received this year, now the show is over now, but if you have a little bit to donate, and they didn't ask us to do this at all, to mention their charity, but if you have some to donate, all the money that they raised through the show is going to the Ronald McDonald House. And I've worked with the Ronald McDonald House before, and they do a tremendous amount of good in providing families a place to stay when their children are undergoing treatments for cancer and terminal illnesses. So here's a link where you can donate. We're also going to give 100% of the proceeds from the ad revenue of this video to the Ronald McDonald House. So, hey, if you didn't like our findings, or if you don't like us, at least you can say that when you're watching this, it's going for a good cause, right?
Exactly.
So, Brett, I know that a lot of people are probably thinking this, right? We spent a lot of time. We now believe, that they're pretty much confirmed as ground projections from spotlights, but you spent extra time trying to figure out where they were coming from. Why? So, one of my favorite t-shirts sums this up. Well, nobody freaking cares. So, why should we? Well,
Yeah.
there are several reasons why we felt that this is very important, and we spent all this time trying to find out the source of it.
Yeah.
The primary reason comes from some people that we came in contact with early on, including the West Bend Airport. So, Britt, I mean, they're still interested. Why? Why is that important?
Well, it was interesting. I reached out to them to talk about if they had noticed any lights, if anyone had called them in regards to any lights, and of course, the people at the West Bend Airport were very
Mm-hmm.
interested in what these lights were, where they came from, what we would find out about them, to share with them. And I've done so along the way, sharing emails or phone calls. Extremely wonderful people. I can't rave enough about the community there, and just the help that we've gotten and the communication that they've wanted to keep up. But from that conversation and learning, don't forget the National Guard is there. So these lights, being seen at such distance and so close to an airport, there are safety issues that go at hand with airports and these types of lights, especially if they're high powered beam lights. So I learned that even with sky trackers, there's a lot that has to be done to have a permit. Then the airports have to be called for safety issues in regards to the airplanes and kind of grounding airplanes with lights that perceive to be what looks like landing lights. And now something that I brought to your attention when talking about this is a hazard. And you're a pilot, Ben. So you were like, oh yeah, we discussed that, and looking further into the safety regulations and issues behind this. So there was more at play than just, like you said, who freaking cares about some lights in the sky when there could be some safety issues looking at it around airports.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you mentioned, pilots, if you're coming in, especially for an instrument approach, that could mean you have really bad visibility and you're coming through cloud cover. Spotlights you didn't expect, shining up into the clouds, they can intensify, possibly, as we talked about, the weather phenomena, and it can look really bright. And also the beacons that they use at airports and the instrument approach lights. You don't want to be confusing pilots with other rotating lights, in certain weather conditions, that they mistake that for the airport, or you're going to get a plane landing on your house or something, horrible. So there's that issue. And then the fact that when we identify things like this, we can put it into our catalog, so to speak, of inventory. So in the future, we're not spending time on this. We can come out and we can tell people there's a new type of light out. It's capable of going this far. It does this type of movement, and it helps in the research, right? So at any rate, the December 1st sighting is the only thing that we've really focused on in this video, and now we've kind of avoided the bigger conversation here that this might be connected to a rash of similar sightings that were occurring up to 80 miles away. And I'm going to pull that up here right now. Some of these happened the same night or within a few weeks of each other. Now, a lot of them happened in Wisconsin. Didn't we have one like in Michigan reported?
Yeah, right? We had one across from Lake Michigan. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then as far north, I would say as Green Bay, and I'm going to pull this video up here so that you guys can see it. This was posted on Twitter by someone responding to some of the reports that we'd made. And look at this. I mean, if you had no idea that this could possibly be a spotlight and you see these things racing all the way to the horizon and back, it's pretty weird, right? And this is pretty much the exact description that Chris Nowak had seen down near Milwaukee, right? And so he and his wife saw this. However, they saw it for like 20 miles. Here's another one.
Mm-hmm.
So this was actually a year ago up in Washington State. And you can see here similar movement. And, we had spoken to him indirectly. And this witness, says, look, I think these things may have gone 30 miles to my north and 20 to the south. It was that big of a span. Okay, so if these are a new type of, light that puts out extreme intensity, they're being seen now all over the country. Now, of course, no rational person is going to suggest that the Flanders were the source of light seen 60 to 80 miles away or those seen in other states. So the most likely explanation then is that we have this new generation of a prosumer, type of spotlight that's capable of very intense projections. And that maybe this year there's, let's say an explosion of sales where these hobbyists are trying them out for the holiday backyard shows or events. It's quite a coincidence, but it is plausible. At this point, however, we have no evidence that there's a coordinated or deliberate hoax attempt. But like we said, at least from a regulation point of view, especially with air traffic, it definitely creates a hazard that needs to be addressed. So we'll kind of leave that at that. If we find out anything else, regarding the patterns or especially now that, Christmas and everything is over, if this continues, it's going to be kind of more, less likely that these are just people's holiday displays.
I think for me with this whole process and this whole investigation and why it was so serious is because on top of just the odd lights that we had captured between Kim and Ken and a few others in the very small proximity location, it all of a sudden started to grow into such a larger area on the map. And we also had, and of course we've discussed it now, and I do think it needs as much attention of what we've given to this element, is that we have some outlier cases. I mean, we are talking about some of these objects that are more spherical that are coming down from tree line basically into the eye line of a vehicle of the car lights and then back up, or surrounding a vehicle, or hovering above a vehicle and swirling around and doing a chase pattern and then taking off. These are things that are, I can't just automatically be like, oh yeah, it's, Flander Christmas lights or somebody else's Christmas lights, because then we're coming into a hazard of blinding people while they're driving. So we really have to we have two scenarios, it seems, that are happening at the same time. And we really have to get a really deep investigation to all of it.
And we didn't even mention, I briefly mentioned that there was another couple of witnesses. That was Angela and her son, who's out in Belgium. And so they're in that same area. And on a different night, I want to say it was the 9th or the 12th of December. And on a different night, they described, now her son was actually quite terrified. And again, we're just conveying what they're telling us. I'm not putting words in their mouth. They said he was terrified because as they were driving, he saw what they described as a more deep blue kind of color, not what the Flanders lights look like, because they're only, I think, 6 miles away from them. And these lights came down to the level of what they said about 30 feet and maybe only 30 feet away from their car. So it's not against cloud cover. And they saw what were
Right.
Orbish types of lights that were going around the car and then went up into the sky. And they said that night, they're like, well, could it be the Flanders lights? And they've sent us video. They've gone driving around, and they could only see the Flanders lights a quarter of a mile, I think is what it was, as they got that close to the Flanders farm. So they feel very confident what they saw was not the Flanders lights. We kind of have to put these things off to the side, though, because this kind of conflict between the data and how we do feel like so much matches up with Flanders, but yet we have something else going on that doesn't quite fit. So go with the most reasonable explanation, right? But we're not discounting what the witnesses said they saw that they didn't record. And this often happens in investigations, and so we're just going to kind of keep our eyes out, keep taking reports, see if more of that starts happening. So on that note, really wanted to thank everybody, the whole community, the Flanders, especially witnesses, Chris, Kim, Ken, the people at the city halls, the police and fire, department, and people who are going around asking questions for us, and the experts and giving their expertise. So many people involved with this. It's been long. I'm not saying that it's over. We do have to keep tabs to see now that the holidays are over if we're still getting these reports. Especially interested in what's going on at the ground level that people are reporting sort of Orbish lights. It's been quite exhausting, but thanks to everybody else, I think we've come a little bit closer to what we think's going on. So we'll keep you updated, and everybody have a great New Year.